Welcome everybody to our Idaho Environmental Forum today. I'm Brandy Wilson, the Idaho Environmental Forum IEF President. And on behalf of the board, I'd like to thank you for joining us to engage in some thoughtful, cordial dialogue on environmental issues important to all of us here in the Gem State. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank our Idaho Environmental Forum sponsors who have continued to provide amazing support from when we had to transition from our in-person events to our virtual events. So I'd like to, in particular, as we're pulling these our sponsor list up, thank you so much. I'd like to thank our sustaining partners. I'd also like to thank our fellows, our supporters, and our colleagues. Please consider becoming a sponsor so that we can continue to provide these discussions to serve Idaho. And you can learn more about our current sponsors and opportunities for sponsorship on our website at www.idahoenvironmentalforum.org. While there, please consider joining us as a member so that you can continue receiving notifications for these events. Membership, as always, is free, and the only thing it costs is your email address. So please sign up with us, and then you'll be sure to be included in these discussions as we go forward. So with that, let's go ahead and dive right in. So Catherine, if you want to go ahead and start sharing the presentation, I'll just give us a little bit of an introduction here so that we're ready to roll. So the Idaho Climate Economy Impacts Assessment is a nonpartisan, science-based resource, and it was released in December of 2021. So today we're going to hear from some of the folks engaged in creating it. We'll cover what it is, how it was created, and some of the key findings from the assessment. And today we have with us 4 experts to talk about the assessment. So we have Dr. Catherine Himes from the McClure Center at University of Idaho, Dr. Patrick Katzenbuehler, Dr. Greg Latta, and Mr. Eric Winford, all from the University of Idaho. I'm going to let them introduce themselves and their part of the assessment as we get talking, and then we'll launch into the question and answer period. So as with our Idaho Environmental Forum panels, please submit your questions directly to me, Brandy Wilson, in the chat, and then I will collate those and put them to the panel once they've finished their initial presentation. So as they're going through, be sure to send those questions to me, and we'll go from there. So Catherine, I guess we'll start with you, and you can give us kind of an introduction and overview of the assessment.
Thanks so much, Brandy. We are really delighted to be here with IEF today. Brandy said that we would each introduce ourselves. So we'll say our name, where we are within the university, and what was our responsibility. So I'm Catherine Himes. I direct the McClure Center for Public Policy Research. I'm based here in Boise. And my role was to help work across all of these research teams and coordinate the assessment. And I am really delighted to talk to you today about what is the assessment, what were some of these key findings. And just a minute here, I seem to have lost the buttons that allow me to advance the slide. Okay, here we go. So the Idaho Climate Economy Impacts Assessment, as Brandy mentioned, was completed in December of 2021. It's a nonpartisan, science-based resource to help Idaho decision makers, business leaders, Idahoans really plan for a prosperous, productive, resilient Idaho economy. We also talk about the assessment in that it's broadly informed, and I'll touch on this in just a few slides. You may be wondering why the assessment, why this, why now? Idahoans really are interested in what climate change means to livelihoods, to the way of life. A lot of Idaho's economy is grounded in natural resources, so this is a very important intersection. We know that science-based, nonpartisan resources can help develop a foundation of understanding, a common vocabulary on a lot of topics, so we endeavored to create the material in this manner. Also, the synthesized economic data that are in the assessment can really be explored at state levels and local levels. And the assessment is connecting the latest scientific research that's specific to Idaho with climate change, looking at economic risks and economic opportunities that affect businesses, residents, local and state economies. And you'll hear all of us talk later in our slides about risks and about opportunities. The assessment has different sections, and I have a slide that shows these different areas that were researched. And each area, so recreation and tourism, rangelands, forests, agriculture, you'll hear about these today, has the latest science that's specific to Idaho, specific to climate change, and then economic data to really look at what the impacts will be. This was led by the McClure Center at the University of Idaho. We were supported by an executive committee, and that executive committee had business perspective, nonprofit perspective, and higher education perspective and leaders. And then an advisory board. This advisory board was very broad. So I'm coming back to that broad note on one of the early slides. Here, businesses, nonprofits, community, and then different levels of government, local, state, federal, and tribal. This slide is very information dense. This information is available on the assessment's website, but I think perusing it briefly gives you a sense of the breadth of the advisory board. We had 40 members, really wanted to have geography from across Idaho, these different sectors that were part of the assessment, wanted to make sure that experts were part of this advisory board. So I'll just mention that we had some different state agencies. We also had different tribal communities, organizations like Potlatch-Deltic, Payette Land Trust, Bogus Basin, also the president of the Idaho Ski Areas Association. So the assessment was a result of over 2 years of work, and the researchers came from Idaho colleges and universities, primarily the University of Idaho, but we're really proud that we have participation from different institutions of higher education. We had 10 research leads, 10 research teams with leads and co-leads. And so you'll hear from my colleagues who led different sections of this work. And each of these 10 research teams had members who were from business, nonprofit, and tribal and other governments in some cases. This work was all shepherded by a postdoctoral fellow who can't be with us today. And so she was really the one who worked very closely with these 10 research teams, deep in the planning processes, deep in the research. And what we endeavored to do was to create a website. So this is not a giant PDF that really only those with technical interest will read. This is a website that has different levels of information. So we have one-page summaries of all of this work. So a one-page summary of agriculture, of rangelands, of forests, of recreation and tourism. And then we also have technical reports that are like a journal article. The technical reports went through a review process like an academic peer review process. And then the advisory board, who you just saw earlier, helped really with these non-technical summaries, these snapshots, to make sure that they were really engaging, had relevant case studies and so forth. The website with all this information, including more content, is uidaho.edu/ICEIA for Idaho Climate Economy Impacts Assessment. The assessment was funded by many different Idaho organizations. This was not funded by a federal research grant. So we have different contributors from all across the state, organizations that have a national footprint as well. I'll just mention a few: Nature Conservancy, Simplot, HP, our national laboratory. But I think what's really important to thank the researchers, because they contributed their time in kind. So what Eric, what Greg, what Pat talked about today, this was really something that they were doing in addition to their day job. So we list these in kind contributions. The assessment has the economic analysis in 6 key areas: agriculture, energy, health, infrastructure, land, which includes forests and rangelands, and recreation and tourism. And then we also have 3 foundational sections online: climate, water, and smoke. I'm going to just touch briefly on what the changing climate looks like in Idaho, and then I will pass it off to my colleagues. So Idaho's climate is measured in 3 key variables: temperature, precipitation, and snowpack. What we know is that temperatures are increasing, as is spring precipitation, rain on snow events. I think that we're having rain on snow events in many parts of the state this week. Peak stream flow is occurring earlier in spring. We also know that snowpack is decreasing, summer precipitation is decreasing, summer stream flow, as well as summer soil moisture. These changes in climate really connect with increasing extreme weather events. Idaho is projected to experience an increase in these extreme weather events in the coming years and decades. So for example, decreasing summer precipitation and increasing temperature can lead to increased droughts. Increased winter and spring precipitation, as well as earlier peak stream flow and rain on snow events, can cause floods and landslides and mudslides. Increasing temperature, lower summer precipitation, and drought can lead to increased wildfire activity, which can cause smoke and poor air quality. Previously burned areas also are at risk for increased mudslides. Now I'm going to hand it off to Patrick Hatzenbuehler, who'll introduce himself, and he will take you through some highlights from the agriculture sector.
Thank you very much, Catherine. As she mentioned, I'm Patrick Hatzenbuehler. I'm an assistant professor and extension specialist in crops economics at the University of Idaho, based in Twin Falls at the Research and Extension Center here. Broadly, my research areas are in the supply and demand fundamentals for crop markets, and I do a lot of price analysis. So that's kind of my background. But my role with regard to the ICEIA was to lead the section for agriculture, and I had another helper, main leader, Chloe Wardropper, who's also based at the University of Idaho, who focused a lot on the case study aspects of the chapter. But the main takeaway messages for the agriculture section are that agriculture is important for the Idaho's economy, and especially in the southern Idaho irrigated agriculture region, where I'm based here in the Magic Valley. Agriculture is a big part of the economy, and it's important. And also that climate variables are important for agricultural production. So temperature, carbon dioxide, and precipitation, including as irrigation influenced by snowpack levels, are all important to agriculture production in Idaho. So forecasted climate change effects on agriculture production include changes to planting and harvesting timing, becoming more variable when planting becomes available in terms of when the winter ends and people can get out into the field and plant, and then also how long the planting or the growing season lasts in terms of length of time between planting and harvest. And so there's expected to be adjustments in terms of longer growing season, but also limited to the degree to which water is available. And so there's expected that irrigation water demand will be earlier, more water, also greater in terms of the quantity of water demanded in response to higher temperatures. But the effects of higher temperatures and higher CO2 levels varies across crops. There's a peer-reviewed study that I cite in the ag section by Raja Gapalan and co-authors, and he's based at and they're based at Washington State, about the projections from 2030 about Pacific Northwest irrigated crop yield projections, and it's heterogeneous across crops. So they're expected increase effects of higher CO2 levels for broadly across all crops that are grown in the region, but the temperature effects are negative for most crops. But the net effect ends up being an increase for yields for hay and wheat, but a decrease for potatoes. And so these kind of different things of what to expect for the different crops will have a big impact for planning, crop rotations, and other types of farm management decisions moving forward. But the key is really going to be water management at the farm level, and also at a systematic level of how water is currently stored, whether that meets the demand needs in the future, and how those things will evolve over time.
Greg, you're on mute.
Yeah.
I did try to click that. My name's Greg Latta. I'm challenged on Zoom, I guess. I'm the director of the Policy Analysis Group at the University of Idaho. And I was a co-author of the forest section with Jeff Hickey here at the University of Idaho as well. I'm a forest economist. I do market models. I work for the federal government in doing some of the projections they do for international climate policy and national climate policy. So I just wanted to touch on, I didn't do 3, I did 4, risks and opportunities. So the first I was going to point out in terms of risk is that forests have gone from being a carbon source or a carbon sink to a carbon source, meaning they emit more greenhouse gases or CO2 than they sequester into the atmosphere. And that's state and private forests, right? They're largely stable with livestock and have declining dead stocks on them. But conversely here, federal forests tend to have declining live tree stocks and increasing dead tree stocks in a landscape where natural disturbance dominates the levels of management activity that we see. So second one on the gloom and doom risk here is that widespread and severe forest disturbances in Idaho will continue to affect ecosystem services provided. Right, that recreation, timber, other things that we do in forests and the habitat that they provide are all at risk. But there's also opportunities. So while fire risk is largely a function of climate, fire intensity can be changed by fuel reduction efforts. And right, we know that the driving factors for fuel behavior are going to be climate, topography, and fuels. And we can affect fuels. And so that's a real chance for us to go in and do something to benefit the future. And then finally, I have, while we haven't seen a forest carbon project or offset project here in Idaho, I'm thinking in the voluntary or the regulatory market in California, there are new programs that are starting up that are exploring these natural climate solutions that may work here in the state of Idaho. The issue is a lot of these evolve around or revolve around sequestering more carbon or storing more carbon on the landscape. And in a fire-prone landscape that has less water and is more dry, because of increasing heat, that's a problem. And so we need to look at other ways that we can benefit from reducing trees in these programs. So there you go, 2 and 2, sorry, not 3. And I'll mute out here better than I muted in. Pass off to Eric.
All right, thank you, Catherine and Brandy, for having us here. As mentioned, my name is Eric Winford. I'm the Associate Director of the University of Idaho Rangelands Center based out of Boise. And I co-led the development of the Rangelands chapter with Dr. Catherine Lee, also of the University of Idaho. And I helped with sections on fisheries and wildlife, especially ungulates. And so the Rangelands Center does interdisciplinary research and outreach across the state with a number of different partners. And we work on issues such as wildfire, invasive species, wildlife habitat, livestock grazing, and community well-being. And in this section right here, I'm just going to take a couple of takeaways from the Rangelands chapter. And as Catherine mentioned, we're going to be experiencing quite a bit of changing in precipitation, both in the timing of precipitation and the type of precipitation. And then we're going to start seeing warmer temperatures across all the year, but especially during the summer. And together, those changes could cause heat stress in livestock, which might require more water or shade for the health of the animals. It could decrease forage availability by reducing the quantity or quality of the grasses available. And it could reduce habitat for salmon by limiting the stream miles that are suitable for spawning or rearing. Another impact is going to be that drought, wildfire, and invasive species all work together. And that can be a big problem for sensitive species like sage grouse because of the reduction in habitat quality. Plus, those three can increase restrictions and even cause closures for recreation and livestock, for example, following a wildfire. However, there are some opportunities to increase the resilience of rangelands, including restoring degraded areas, working collaboratively with rangeland fire protection associations or RFPAs to prevent wildfires and fight them, and preparing livestock operations for drought. So I will turn it over to Catherine now.
Thanks so much, Eric, and Greg and Pat. I'm going to talk about recreation and tourism. I served as the co-author of this section. I worked with Dr. Alex Moss, who is at the University of Idaho. He is an agricultural economist, and he really was the lead of this section, but I stepped in to write a few key areas. Idaho has a substantial and growing tourism industry, largely based on the outdoor recreation opportunities provided by our land, our lakes, and our rivers. Climate change is likely to influence the economic risks and opportunities this sector experiences and affect the overall well-being of Idahoans who engage in recreation and tourism. Smoke from wildfires and high temperatures impact motorized and non-motorized visitation and use of public lands and pose health risks to humans and wildlife. Changes in precipitation, which others mentioned, and warmer air temperatures affect water temperature and stream flow. This can put fish species and fisheries at risk, impacting both revenue from recreational fishers and revenue for outfitters and guides. Across the state, the amount of time that snow covers the ground has decreased, and in many locations, ski and snowmobile seasons are projected to grow shorter with decreasing snow quality throughout the 21st century. But there are opportunities. There are ways for resorts to diversify year-round revenue streams, and we have seen this already within the states. Winter sports enthusiasts from other areas of the country that are impacted in ways more significant than in Idaho may recreate in Idaho, and this is a trend that's also been observed. And then finally, financial losses from loss of summer recreation may be offset by increased opportunities in fall and spring months. I am going to shift to the final slide here in our presentation, and then I think Brandy will pose some questions to us. So all of this content, again, is available on the website uidaho.edu/ICEIA. Each section that we've talked about, as well as water, climate, smoke, has a non-technical one-page snapshot and a technical report that's like a journal article. There also is a section called Tools and Resources, and there you'll find a lot of visualization resources, and they're categorized by all of these different sections, so you can easily find agriculture, health, energy, and so forth. Our assessment ambassadors, so members of the advisory board, members of the McClure Center Advisory Board, our researchers are sharing this across the state with different leaders, governments, businesses, and others interested. Feel free to reach out to the McClure Center if you're interested in having a presentation to your organization. I listed our phone number and our email address here. And I'm going to pass it back to Brandy.
Thank you guys so much for giving us that overview of the assessment. I really appreciate it. And just to point out for our audience that today we're covering 3 out of the 6 economic sectors that were analyzed. And so, we've got those other sectors on energy and human health and infrastructure as well. But today we're really focusing on agriculture, lands, which includes the forests and the rangelands that you heard from, and the recreation and tourism aspects of it, because this is just such a broad assessment. We can't cover it all. So we wanted to focus on those 3 issues for this audience. So I really, really appreciate you guys making yourselves available to come explain this to us. And so I have a couple of questions to kind of get us started, but I am starting to get some questions come in through the chat as well. So that's great. Just a reminder to everybody, when you have questions, just send those directly to me, and then we'll get to as many of those as we can in the rest of our time together today. So you've each hit on some of the key takeaways, and it's absolutely undeniable and I think obvious to our audience at this point that there's water running through the entire assessment, right? The river is definitely running through this one. So exploring kind of the ag and range side of that a bit, I'd like to ask Pat and Eric in particular, what economic impacts do we expect to see because of changes in our ability to store water at particular times of the year?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'll go first since I was first in the way the question was read, Eric.
Sure.
But yeah, in terms of the ag side, and as an economist, we talk about behavioral change and focus on that, and so how people respond to different incentives and changes in the environment and their things. But I think it's important to point out that there's systematic economic conditions that are important from the investments in water storage and the ability to measure and project future storage from groundwater and surface water facilities that we have currently in place, and whether those are going to be matching and how those match up with expected demand for water in the line. And then also at the farm level, so how individual producers are responding to their own availability of water. And we saw this past summer, especially examples in which curtailments are a real thing, and they do happen, especially north of where I am in the Magic Valley. In the Wood River Valley, people had to respond to curtailments and shut off water, and only got a couple cuttings of hay when they were expecting about 4 or 5. And so those are things directly at the farm level, but also at the more systematic, broader economic level, which agriculture in Idaho will be impacted by water management moving forward.
And on rangelands, well, really when thinking about storing water in rangelands, I think what we're really thinking about, what I think about is soil moisture. And because that's where most of the water is going to be stored unless it runs off or unless there's a small pond for livestock water. And so having a nice snowpack that melts slowly allows for a lot of water to be absorbed into the soil where it can be used throughout the growing season and can be slowly moved into streams. But as precipitation shifts from snow to rain, we'll likely see less water being stored in the soil and more immediate runoff, especially if there are rain on snow events that cause a rapid melting, or if there are big thunderstorm events instead of a nice gentle soaking rain, there's likely to be more intense runoff. And compounding that change in precipitation amount and timing, it will be increasing summer temps. That's going to reduce soil moisture because of additional evaporation. So really the impact is going to be felt in the quantity and quality of forage for animals. Plants will likely green up earlier, but also go dormant and dry earlier. And the timing could benefit invasive grasses over native grasses, but some of those invasive grasses would also decline in cover production as well. So we don't really have a great model for exactly what they'll look like or how it'll impact the state's economy, as the impacts will be felt differently from site to site and across operations. But we can draw a comparison between drought conditions and what this is going to look like. And in a case study in the report, we look at how a short-term severe drought can impact ranch income, and shows that it can reduce ranch income by about 28%. So that could be a pretty significant impact for small producers across the state.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, it's great that we've got this assessment where we can start to look at some of those more local impacts like you were talking about. I mean, you can even drill down to the next level of what parts of the state are going to experience different kinds of outcomes. And so it's really, it's great that we've got this baseline work. And I know, Pat, in your section on agriculture, it goes into the different growing regions as well. So it's good to have some of this micro to go with those macro trends that people have been talking about for the last several years with climate change. So in addition to, well, in the introduction that you were talking about, Catherine, for the assessment, you touched on the potential for the increased frequency and duration of wildfire and smoke and some of the impacts that has. So I'm curious to hear from Greg and Catherine, how does this play out in terms of the economics for forests and for recreation and tourism? So Greg, do you want to start with forests, and then we can go to Catherine for the rec and tourism impacts from wildfire and smoke?
Sure, and actually I'm muted there.
Good job.
Forestry in the state's a pretty big deal. It's about $2.4 billion of the state's economy, over 31,000 jobs that we're talking about. And wildfire, what it does, while that's mostly affecting federal lands at higher elevations, it's also affecting the private land, and it basically is a deterrent to investment in silviculture if that silviculture is at risk. There's also a great opportunity right now to have these forests update their national forest plans. So when we're looking at the Forest Service, out of the 112 national forests in the United States or clusters, only 71 haven't had a new plan. Only 21 have revised their plans in the last 15 years, and 20 are in revision. So they're outdated. I think there's only what is it, maybe 9 of them that mention carbon. So the national forests, I think, need to step up and show that they're being proactive in this.
Yeah, sounds like a good opportunity. So Catherine, what do you see from the recreation and tourism side?
Well, recreation and tourism, I didn't give the number in my brief slide, but in 2019, the U.S. BEA estimated that 37,000 Idahoans are employed in sectors that are related to recreation and tourism. And this number goes up to well over 100,000 if you consider food sector in particular. And the numbers that we have specific to outfitting and guiding in Idaho are several years old, but that's well over $1 billion. And I think a lot of Idahoans that live in small towns that really depend on recreation and tourism know the significant economic value that it has. But when you think about increasing frequency of wildfires, duration, and smoke, it's definitely consequential for most of the non-snow-based sports and uses that were covered in the recreation and tourism part of the assessment. So we talk about boating, OHV use, hiking, camping, fishing, and biking. And so really there likely will be this decrease in overall usage. We've seen this in other states. We've seen this in Idaho. And, Pat, I think, touched in his remarks about sort of how you measure things as an economist, and one way to measure is sort of this implicit use and enjoyment of these activities. And so it's impactful for people who are coming to recreate and they are tourists, but it's also important for us to consider the consequences for outfitters and guides and these 100,000 Idahoans that are in the sector.
Yeah, and actually, I'm just going to shift gears a little bit here and go to a couple of the questions that we're getting coming through in the chat, because it really dovetails in with what you were just talking about, Catherine. So one of the questions that we got is, what is the impact on those summer recreation activities, particularly changes in seasonal water flow for the rafting industry? Did the study get into that level of detail, and do you have anything that you can contribute towards that question?
It's a great question, and the way recreation and tourism was carved out is by boating broadly. There isn't really rafting in particular, but that definitely is a consideration. Is what about the total amount of water and whether an area can be usable? What about the duration of the season? If the season is compressed, what does that mean for, then could you say, well, we could get in earlier in the season, but then we might be running into those increasing peak stream flows. And then is there actually too much water in some of the rivers for use? So there are a lot of questions and sort of a lot of different ways that you can analyze this information. What I like to talk about is that we're sometimes not arriving at a specific number for the impact, but we're showing the math. So it's like when your teacher said, you need to show all of your steps for this math problem. We're showing all of those steps. So decision makers can look at that and say, oh, okay, here are key considerations for us, for our association, for our company, for me as a landowner, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and that actually leads very well into another question that came through in the chat about whether there's a next phase to this study, because the person who asked the question has looked into the studies and said, it seems like we need to understand the total dollar impacts to Idaho. So we've got, for example, in the agriculture report that there's a decrease in crop yield identified, but what is that projected impact to overall Idaho agriculture for the next 50 years, for example? Is there any additional comment on, I love this concept of we've shown you all the steps to do the math, but is there a future phase where we would actually then go do the math, or are we sort of pausing at this point?
So I can take that one. This assessment was designed to be a snapshot in time to really capture what we knew with the latest science that was coming in 2019, 2020, 21. And so we would love to do more work, but I think that it would be really important to get funding from a federal grant, for example, and whether we'd be able to do that breadth, I'm not sure. It might be that we focus on working lands because there sometimes are more opportunities in that space. But right now, this is that look at what were things pretty much in 2021, what we knew at that time.
Okay, great. Thank you. And this is a question for everybody on the panel, so we'll just take it in turn here. But the person would like to know what really surprised you, or what do you find most important out of the study? I know you each shared your 3 key takeaways from the study, but which one really struck you in your study area? And what do you feel needs to be done immediately, if anything, by policymakers, natural resource managers, or just business owners who are looking at these assessments? Like what's the key takeaway or thing that you think action that you think needs to happen immediately? And is there one of you who would like to start with that question? I hate to call on you if one of you is like, oh, pick me, but
I guess we can just go in the order that we've been going.
Okay, great. Thank you, Pat.
Yeah, so I'll start. I think the biggest, not surprise, but thing that just stood out the most after working through the report and working with colleagues and looking at the science was just the realization to the degree that every single aspect of agricultural production to processing will be impacted by climatic factors, especially increasing temperatures. And so that in that sense, adaptation to these changes is required at every single aspect of production. So whether that be deciding what to plant, even pre-planting, but then deciding when to plant, and then pest management, weeds and insects through growing season, water management, timing of harvest, planning harvest and post-harvest management. Every single aspect of that has some opportunity to do some adaptation and opportunity to investigate what will be most impactful on their own operations.
So in short, everything. We have to look at everything right now. Okay. All right. Greg, what was the key finding for you, and what needs to be done right now?
Well, I mean, what needs to be done is getting on, with the work at hand. We have too many trees, and we need to figure out what to do with them. I'd like to see more of the emphasis shift from carbon to water when it comes to trees and forests, and having overstocked forests. But we have to get to where we can quantify it, and so that's what we're working on.
Very good, Eric.
So I'll continue that theme of water that Greg mentioned. And for me, this was one of the sections that was led by Chris Caudill of the University of Idaho, looking at impacts on fisheries. And the reduction, is there going to be a substantial reduction in habitat miles for important species like salmon, bull trout, and potentially some other trout species like rainbow trout? And that could really limit both the amount of spawning and rearing habitat. It could impact the lifestyle or the number of fish, because it increases in mortality as fish move to and from their spawning and rearing habitat. And that, could impact both fisheries and a lot of other people in a number of ways. So I think that was a real eye opener for me. And linked to that, I think we want to be thinking about what can we do to, cool that water down and keep the water, slowly moving out so it's not flushing out so fast. And I think there's things that we could do on rangelands, like restoring meadows and stream riparian areas that could be really effective. In forests, there could be some really novel approaches to silviculture as well. So yeah, I think water is going to affect us all in the future.
So I think the piece that surprised me the most actually was in a different section of the assessment. It was in the health section. And there certainly are ways that humans are impacted by increasing temperature and smoke and so forth. But one thing in particular, I think stood out to me, and it probably, if I have the time to think about the intersections with rangeland, agriculture, forest, I think it would apply there as well, which is that some of the health impacts, it may not be a huge volume of people. So for example, vector-borne disease, there may be small numbers of Idahoans impacted. However, the cost per person, for that person, for their family, for the healthcare system is really significant because some of these diseases linger with the person for a really long time. So I think that there's sort of the ways to think about impacts in terms of volume, but then there's also sort of the cost per event. And so I'm still wrapping my mind around that from the health section, but I think it certainly transcends across all of the sections.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that was a takeaway for me too, in reading all of the sections and all the snapshots as a part of this effort, is the interconnection, the level of interconnection among all of the topics is just so profound. And, we've talked today about how water runs through it all, but this idea of community and individual health as well is such a dominant theme throughout. So thank you for touching on that. So in terms of, we do have another question. Well, we have about 3 or 4 questions that all sort of touch on this idea of policy and public policy. And so Catherine, as our McClure Center for Public Policy person, and I know the McClure Center Advisory Board has been quite engaged in the assessment as well. What are you hearing in terms of reactions from folks in the policy realm? And then are there any next steps in terms of developing recommendations or policymaker engagement that you can share?
Yeah, so I think I'll start with part 2 first, which is that the assessment, as I mentioned earlier, is this nonpartisan, science-based, broadly informed resource. And what that means is that we're talking about risks and we're talking about opportunities, but there's no recommendation. That's not where the assessment goes. That's up to folks who are using the assessment. So if an organization says, gosh, we're looking at all the steps of the math here, and here's where we want to go with our recommendation, that's great. We would love for you to do that. We're providing this nonpartisan science-based resource, but again, there's no recommendations that come from it. I'll turn to the first part of the question, which is what does this look like in terms of sharing with the policy decision maker space. So we have shared this with the governor's office. Partway through the work, we met with 3 members of our federal delegation office. And then we also do plan to speak with Idaho Association of Counties and of Cities, because this is really important at those decision-making levels as well. And I know a lot of our ambassadors are sharing with different cross-sections of groups. We've also met with the Idaho Coalition of Land Trusts. They're really interested in, Eric mentioned, fish and alpine ecosystems and ungulates, and also the working lands that we've been talking about today. That's really important for groups like ICOLT. And so we'll continue to share this. But again, there are no recommendations that are part of the assessment. We're really talking about what are those key takeaways and then answering questions in these presentations.
Great, thank you. And in terms of questions, we've just got just kind of a few more. I want to just kind of take us around the horn one more time. So we've talked a lot about the challenges facing Idaho's economy and our communities and our working lands and wildlife and all of that other stuff. But one of the purposes of the assessment that Catherine, you touched on earlier, was to support discussion about like, how do we keep Idaho's economy strong and prosperous going forward? And, Pat, in that agriculture question that we just discussed, you touched on some of the things that we need to do in terms of, looking at different planting scenarios and times of year and things of that nature. And Greg, you pointed out the need to really look at what we've got in terms of our our timber inventory and addressing that so that we can reduce the catastrophic wildfire risk. And Eric, you had some great input too on, grazing time and rotation. But I'd really like to take a minute to kind of dive into, are there other things that we need to be looking at, and what kinds of things should policymakers, those local communities, Catherine, that you mentioned, and businesses be focused on. So I'm going to start. I'm just going to go backwards this time just for fun. So Catherine, what are some of the ways that the recreation and tourism industry should continue to look at things and be strong going forward?
So I think that it's really important for the community to be agile. And what that means is to seize opportunities and to really think creatively. And, it could look like opportunities to expand seasons. For example, expanding winter seasons, the use of snowmaking. It could look like expanding summer opportunities into fall or open them earlier in spring. So maybe that takes the form of trails for biking or places for OHV use. It also really looks like shoulder seasons. Are there possibilities for extending the shoulder seasons? And I mentioned diversifying revenue sources. We were now seeing some downhill areas holding summer concerts and using that as a source of revenue, or conferences. And then I think finally, I would say that there's also ways in which outfitters and guides may work with different species that may become very much of interest to people who are recreating in the state. Eric touched on this a little bit when he mentioned forests, but as stream temperatures change, fish. As stream temperatures change, the fish sections do a really great job looking at the 1 and 2 degrees Celsius temperature change. And there will be the opportunity under those scenarios to have recreation around different fish species. And so it may be that then outfitters and guides have to kind of pivot a little bit or be nimble or agile in that way. But I think there are opportunities, but there also are some things that maybe are going to change in the future.
So since you just wrapped on that bit about fish, let's go ahead and switch over to Eric. Eric, what kinds of things do you see? I mean, because this range section was so broad. I mean, it's everything from working lands to fish and wildlife habitat and hunting and all of that. So what do you see going forward?
Well, it is hard to pick just a few things, but I think really one of the biggest things we can do is think about soil health and improve soil health, because healthy soils can store more water and they can store carbon too. And in rangelands, we can improve soil health by maintaining native grass cover, by maintaining grass height after grazing, by having appropriate litter cover, and by reducing soil erosion. And so by just having healthy soils, we can really increase the ability of plants to resist and recover following impacts like drought, wildfire, and invasive species that we know are coming. And then, there is some grazing strategies that we could think about changing. It depends on everyone's operation, though. But I think going forward, we need to think about being flexible in management. Maybe that means shifting timing of key dates and used for grazing, changing grazing strategy, or even changing the breed or class of livestock used. But overall, I think, and I'll Catherine hit on this, is that I think we need to be successful. We need to focus on people, because we need to invest in people so that they have the tools, the knowledge, and the capacity to adapt. And it's going to take some creativity to adjust and to be successful. It might mean changing our habits and doing things differently from what we're used to. So to adapt is just going to require a focus on people and their ability to make those adjustments.
That is such an important point, that it's really just going to come down to people and, giving them the tools and knowledge to be able to change and adapt as we go forward. So, Greg, what do you see in terms of, prosperity for the forest sector going forward?
All right, I'll jump the other way. So those were kind of reactionary, and I'll go proactive.
Great.
I'd like to see us get some of this carbon off the landscape into things like tall buildings. Cross-laminated timber is a great thing. We have an issue with using small pieces of wood in the state, so maybe some energy or biochar could be an option as well. And then finally, going away from carbon again to think about albedo. And so the reflectance of the landscape in our area, it may make a lot more sense to have white landscapes in the winter reflecting that heat as opposed to green landscapes absorbing it and not sequestering much carbon. So I think we need to think of different solutions for the inland west that are proactive in getting at this solution as well.
That makes a lot of sense, and that's a great way to look at this too. So, Pat, what do you see in the future to kind of bring this whole discussion home for us?
I would like to echo Eric's thoughts about soil health and the importance of that, and especially the intersection between technology and practice, adjusting of practices. I mean, in this past summer drought, especially in northern Idaho, it was just exemplified the importance of soil health and practices like limited tillage, no tillage. Like those farmers that were adopting those practices at least got some kind of yield, and those that didn't really got nothing this year. And so just seeing the high wheat prices that they are now, those that got something in the bin are making some money now, and those that didn't are relying on insurance and other kinds of risk management tools. But I think there's a lot of opportunity to explore those kind of practices and what's inhibiting adoption of those, but also opportunities to experiment. We have some examples of experimentation in the ag section, farmers that are doing some experiments on their own farm. I think those producers that are open to experiments, sharing ideas amongst each other, is going to be a key to success moving forward.
Great, thank you. So thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. I really appreciate it. I think we've had some great conversation, some good questions here today about the climate economy impact assessment. And now everybody knows where to go to check that out. I did drop the link in the chat box earlier, so everybody should be able to have that and get there. And I'd like to thank our sponsors once again for making all of these programs possible. Please go to our website and sign up at idahoenvironmentalforum.org to become a member, and anybody can become a sponsor, so please consider that. And again, thank you for coming, and I hope you have a great day. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.